little town called Leaper's Fork, after Sir Henry Leaper before. So it's one of the original land grants of Tennessee. It's in a really cool area where we have a lot of country music singers and stuff too, so it's a really cool place in Tennessee. But anyway, I really appreciate you guys coming out. There's going to be some small numbers, so if you have bad eyesight, I'd probably come up closer to the front if you get a chance. As I started growing orchids in 2001, which you guys have some fantastic growers and experienced growers in your midst right here in Weslaco. And so that's 2001 is not very old for an orchid grower. But my wife gave me a hybrid Phalaenopsis for Valentine's Day, and I still have that plant. So to a testament of love and orchids, you know. And much to her chagrin, you know, she didn't know what was going to happen, so it's gone crazy since then. As Janet noted, I've been a biologist ever since I was like 5 years old, so I'm not going to do the math and tell you how long that's been. But I've been working with biology and biological systems for many, many years, and applied a lot of what I've learned in other animal and plant systems to be able to grow orchids the way I do now. So I'm going to start out, since a lot of what I learned is applied from past learning, to see where you guys learn in terms of your past learning. So we're going to have a pop quiz from high school biology 101A. What do plants eat? And this is, anybody can pop off in terms of
carbon monoxide, whatever we exhale is what they eat.
Anything else?
Is that the right answer?
Not yet.
They breathe that.
Minerals.
Some minerals.
Water.
Some water.
It depends on what kind it is.
So, no, not really. I would say green plants. Green plants. So we can keep moving on. Technically, plants don't eat. Plants are autotrophs, if you remember that from way back when. Plants are autotrophs, which means they make their own food. Now, they do make it from CO2 in water, but the basic thing about all green plants in the process of photosynthesis is that it's not really a consumptive basis, but plants intake primarily water and CO2 with a few nuts and bolts for minerals and things. And they convert that to sugars, which is what they use for their metabolic needs. Same as we produce everything, all of our metabolic needs are pretty much run off of carbohydrate sugars too. So the technical answer is that plants are autotrophs to make their own food. Now the reason I'm going through all this is because what do orchids eat? And when we talk about food and things eating, we never associate that with a negative situation. Maybe more so these days when you're talking about overeating and being excessively heavy or too much sugar. But it's a paradigm shift in how we think. So it's like instead of considering fertilizer as a food of which no harm can come, we really need to consider fertilizer as a nutrient supplement. Now, no one would turn their entire life into eating nothing but vitamins out of a vitamin pill bottle. And normally we would say, oh, eventually, we're going to have a toxic situation from eating too many vitamins. And that's really what's going on with the plants. So instead of considering it, and I'm going to keep referring it to food, and every time I say the word food, someone ought to throw a rock at me from out there, because I'm still, to this day, after all these years of feeding my plants, I still kind of have this thing in the back of my head which says, food is good and more is better. So it's part of a little bit of, the Italian grandmother in me. It's just like, you gotta eat, you're too skinny. So anyway, this is my Papillepilum delanatii. It's this big because of the nutrition program. No, it's not. But it's a species that's responded very favorably to what I've been doing over the years. Just in terms of reference, the big nutrition change that I incorporated in was May of 2011. So a lot of this stuff is putting into practice everything starting about May 2011, which you'll get, when we get to the case histories at the end, you'll see some pretty fantastic results for just the last 4 years. Okay, so once again, it's like I've only been growing since 2001, but on the other hand, I'm pretty active about getting into the research aspects and finding out what everybody's doing and really trying to scale up what I'm doing according to what everyone else does. And I thought I started to hear the same things over and over again, that when it came to nutrition, it's something you don't have to worry about. Plants can feed, you can't feed to excess. That plants in general only uptake what they need and let the rest pass through. There's no such thing as a feeding issue. And then if you still are losing plants, it's usually because they say orchids have a limited time spring and a certain amount of mortality is normal. And it's like, I think maybe that's because vendors want to sell more plants or something. But I've heard it a lot where, especially in oddball species, everybody seems to get 3 to 5 years out of it and it dies. Oh, it must be its normal lifespan. And then, you could probably find some contradictory information in the wild and somebody's able to tag a plant, keep it for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So the next one, that species are difficult, and orchids in general, because they require such specialized conditions. And one of the things that people get excited about is the fungal associates. So I've seen this a lot. It died because it didn't have the right mycorrhizal fungi associated with it. So don't expect them to do good. We're basically keeping the things in an artificial 50% system. So, enjoy what you can out of it, but don't expect them because it'll be fantastic because there's just such super specific conditions for these plants to thrive. And then the last one, which is kind of a more long-term thing, disease control, i.e. like soft rots and pest issues and botrytis, a lot of these things that are really common to our plants. Crown rot, that's a big use, crown rot. Disease control is a matter of use of the appropriate chemicals. Physane is a popular one. Clorox, a lot of disinfecting type systems. So there's no, I often hear it where, there's no combination of nutrition that's really preventive medicine for our plants. You got to use the right system.
Can I ask a real quick question?
Sure.
I don't know, I'm having a blonde moment. Are you telling us this is true, or are you telling us this is fable?
I think that these are myths propagated through the culture system that
Okay, that's what I needed to know.
Yeah. So I don't know how many of you guys have seen this, but this is off the Antec Orchid website. It's been there since about 2004, 2005. But you can find almost the exact same table on any county extension website for whether it's tomatoes, cucumbers, corn, the symptoms of deficiency versus the symptoms of excess. And what I thought was pretty crazy is that, once again, as the Italian grandmother kicks in, I never realized that there was a symptom of excess side of this whole chart. All I ever saw was symptoms of deficiency. So when our plants would do things like, reduce vigor and chlorosis of older leaves, blah, 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 it's like, oh, it's nitrogen deficient, and start trying to figure out ways to increase the nitrogen in the fertilizer. Same for, calcium, poor growth, deformed newer leaves, blah, blah, blah. Blackened leaf tips. This is one that I see a lot in various people's collection, is the burnt leaf tip symptoms. And people will say, oh, there's not enough calcium in the system, and so you got to start putting a lot of oyster shell and stuff in your potting mixes. That's a real popular one, especially for the slipper growers. But if you look, when you say, and I'm going to follow potassium. Potassium is my lead indicator in this whole thing that I'm going through. The symptoms of too much potassium are the same as the symptoms for nitrogen deficiency, magnesium, calcium, iron, zinc, copper, and manganese deficiencies. So, once again, the symptoms of excess and the symptoms of deficiency can often be the same thing. So that was the other thing when I first saw this table. It's like, how do you know if it's too much or too little because it's all looking the same. Isn't that kind of confusing? So anyway, I just assume that, you know, because everyone says that nutrition can't be overdone, I just completely ignored this side for years and years. Once again, this is off of a county extension website, and it shows leaf tissue sufficiencies with respect to growth indices. So whether or not you're just trying to get more growth out of a plant, and in the case of our crop plants, you want to get more tomatoes, more corn, more food out of it. So you can see that yield from a deficient standpoint starts climbing up to a critical value, and then you get a nice big flat zone. This is where you can do no wrong in terms of how much nutrient is in that leaf. It's pretty broad and it's pretty easy to get to. But then there is a point where even the agronomists say too much is too much. And you start getting decreased growth, decreased yield, health problems as you get down to death at a certain point. And this whole chart is how much nutrient is in the leaf. So there's a pretty good body of science now where you take a leaf off a plant, you blow it up, and you find out how much nitrogen and potassium and all the different elements are in that leaf. And they'll go back through and determine based on indices of what the ideal tomato or corn plant is, where it should be. And then you can modify your nutrient supplementation on the basis of that. Okay, so on a perspective basis, too much or too little? When we're feeding MSU fertilizer, how many of you folks use MSU fertilizer? Now MSU fertilizer was based on leaf tissue leaf tissue values. So they went into a greenhouse, they looked at the best looking orchids they could find, they took the leaves and then they analyzed it to see, how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium was in those leaves, and trace goodies, and then they kind of developed a fertilizer around to what they thought was an optimal growing plant. And that's under the premise that orchids only take what they want and leave the rest behind. So the basic bottle direction is the whole weekly fertilizer feeding method. How many of you are familiar with weekly?
Yes.
That's something that I read about back in 2001. So when you're using weekly bottle directions of MSU fertilizer, you're applying about 100 ppm of nitrogen, 113 or so ppm of potassium. And the conductivity, which is like the total salt measure, is actually 4 times what we have here, which is 150. So multiply 150 by 4. So the conductivity is about 600 microsieverts. All that said and fine and good, a lot of us grow weekly, year in, year out, and get at least some of the results that we're happy with. However, this is very recent. Within the last few years, there was a paper that came out where they measured how much was in the water of nitrogen and potassium and conductivity, how much was in the water actually coming down the trees in trees in Borneo, where a lot of our orchids come from. Epiphytic trees, epiphytic plants exposed to water in Borneo during the dry season when it's raining only about once every 5 days. The other thing that I hear too is that in the wild, in the jungle, there's all this bird poop and frog poop and ant poop and stuff like that. Orchid people love to talk about poop apparently. But in the case of this particular study, they looked at the water dripping out of bird nest ferns growing on the side of these trees, which often had ant colonies in it, and would accumulate some bird poop and some frog poop and some bat poop. So anyway, the study they went during a rainfall, they grabbed water dripping down the trees above the bird nest fern, and then they caught the water dripping out below the bird nest fern, and then they went in between the trees when the water was just draining down through the leaves. And if you look and compare these numbers to our weekly feeding, you see that the real jungle doesn't have a lot going for it. It's an order of magnitude less than our weekly feeding. So, and these aren't multiplied by 4 either. So, max connectivity is under 100 microseconds. So that's, a tree in Borneo. Anybody familiar with Phragmipedium cavachii, that big purple slipper from, yeah. So anyway, Manola Arias went down and actually took some water from around the roots during the dry season when it only rains once a day instead of raining continuously for weeks on end. And so here's the N, K, they didn't get P out of it, and the calcium magnesium numbers, bicarbonate. So this is what Phragmipedium cavachii see in Peru during the dry season. Basically less than 1 ppm of nitrogen. It's not even on the scale as for Borneo. Potassium is less than a ppm. The connectivity is pretty high actually, 250, which is just like Nashville tap water, by the way. And then you got, look at all this calcium, 45 ppm, magnesium 4 ppm, bicarbonate ion, alkalinity, 127 ppm. So this water here is just like Nashville tap water. And it's probably not that much different from what you guys have down here in Weslaco, because I know that it's illegal to put that much nitrogen through your drinking water supply. So anyway, keep this in mind when we're trying to feed our orchids on an eco-relevant basis. That weekly is nowhere near eco-relevant. So, in getting back to that whole thing about too much or too little, this is kind of evidence that suggests that we're really on the too much side instead of the too little side.
Well, real quick, is that pH thing that you talked about, is that normal, high or low?
That's pretty average, actually.
Pretty average?
The alkalinity thing?
Oh, yeah.
For surface waters, it's pretty average.
Okay.
There's nothing really that high.
All right. Thank you.
Now, chemists will get into big battles with people about the difference between alkalinity and pH. They track, but the thing that's really most important from biology is really bicarbonate ion, the alkalinity, rather than pH. So I know that most of us, we have access to a pH meter. It's easy to track pH, but alkalinity tends to have differences of opinions that can throw kind of a monkey wrench into things. I'll try to keep everything so that pH is kind of like where we can work with, because it is easier for us to work with pH than bicarbonate ion.
No, I never heard of bicarbonate ion.
Right, but that's really what's causing pH, and it's also causing some of the biological functions in the plants. Oh, by the way, bicarbonate ion is baking soda. Sodium bicarbonate is baking soda. So that puts it in perspective in terms of, yeah, you've heard of baking soda. So.
And isn't that how you make water more alkaline?
Exactly.
Okay. All right, now.
And if you don't believe it, for Borneo and South America where cavachii lives, here's some values for the Amazon basin. And you can see that, well, you may not because the numbers are pretty small, but that is not 10, that's 1.0. So 1 ppm, 1 ppm, 2.5 ppm on that scale, 0.2 ppm for magnesium, 2 and 2. So nothing really gets much more than 1, 2, 3 ppm in the Amazon basin either. So kind of universally, no matter where you are in the tropics, there's just not a lot of these nutrients floating around in the system. The other thing, a lot of our orchids live on the ground in leaf litter instead of up in trees. So this is more important, say, from a ratio of potassium to calcium rather than the absolute values. These units are in milligrams per gram. But the main point to remember is that leaf litter, and this is the case of leaf litter in Sumatra. Leaf litter. That the leaf litter that has orchids growing in it, a lot of cool slippers from Sumatra, by the way, has roughly 7 times more calcium in it than potassium. It's not anywhere near like weekly MSU fertilizer or 20-20-20, which always has more potassium than calcium. And as we get into this, the ratio of calcium to potassium is what's really driving a lot of these issues. And the whole eco-relevancy amount of potassium. And we can skip the panelists. Okay, I'm an aquatic toxicologist or an ecotoxicologist. I've gone backwards. You know, it's like when you first start dealing with fertilizers and orchids, it's like, oh, you know, a teaspoon per gallon or a half teaspoon per gallon, and that makes 100 ppm of nitrogen, or 400 ppm of TDS. You've probably heard those numbers batted around. And or ppms, parts per million, which is milligrams per liter. But from a toxicological dose standpoint, and this is where what really is affecting the organism, I don't care if it's a plant, or a fish, or a freshwater mussel, that what the organism sees is what's called dose. And dose is comprised of 3 different components. The concentration value, i.e. ppms, that we talk about all the time, but then the amount that the organism sees. Are you saturating it, or are you just adding a little drizzle on the top of the plant every time you add? And the duration or frequency. Is the plant getting watered every single day? Is the plant in a water retentive mix so that whatever you throw in sits there for a long period of time, or is the plant mounted so that that plant only gets to see it for a few seconds? When I first started getting into orchids, I could never grow a Phalaenopsis in a pot. If I took that same Phalaenopsis out of the pot and stuck it on a board or a piece of bark, they did great. That's exactly what's going on here. The concentration of fertilizer would be the same in both cases. You know, still my weekly, but the duration of which the plants see it in a pot versus a mount is totally different. And because I could see that eventually, after 8 years of killing stuff, that the less I gave it, which is that times that, the less I gave it, the better it did. Then all of a sudden, I'm talking dose again. I'm not talking just concentration as the issue. So some other things, size matters. How many of you guys do great with blooming size and adult plants but can't raise a seedling to save your life? Again, so the bigger the organism, mainly the more tolerant they are at handling abuse. There's just a lot of reasons for that. There's a few weird things that are fun to talk about, like tigers versus elephants, but save it for some other time. The next one is stuff flows downhill. And generally, the farther you get downstream from your initial sources, the more concentrated it should get. But if you notice from the standpoint of the epiphytes in Borneo, there's not that much up there to start with. So how can it get more and more concentrated as it goes down? And if you're working with, say, Cavachii, that's at the bottom of a cliff, relative to all the stuff dripping down the cliff, how come it definitely demonstrated that you're not dealing with more at the bottom of the hill? So it's just a matter of being able to keep track of how stuff flows in nature and whether or not you should be anticipating higher concentrations of nutrients or lower concentrations of nutrients. Our stuff is all up in the trees, and it gets a lot of direct, extremely dilute rainfall. So on a mass balance basis, you never see a lot of nutrients up in the trees. This all makes sense too if you notice that if the canary is dead, something is wrong. How many of you are familiar with the expression, canary in a coal mine? Thank you. That's where the miners used to take canaries down into the coal mine, and then because the canary was very sensitive to the gases that could ultimately kill a miner down there if they ruptured it into the methane and stuff. And The miners would periodically look over to see if the canary was live or dead during their mining operations, and if it died, time to run, guys, because it's looking bad. There's a lot of other organisms, so it's like when you're looking at your collection, you probably ought to focus on the most sensitive guys, you should focus on the least sensitive guys, the most delicate guys, and not on the stuff that's really doing good. Now, I do it from a toxicological standpoint with aquatic organisms. This is representative of this. I was telling Dan that I got called in 2005 to a freshwater mussel kill in Oklahoma. I get there, the mussels are all dead in the stream, but there's nothing else. The fish are great, nothing else dead. The fish are great, the other macroinvertebrates are great, everybody's swimming around hunky-dory, but all the mussels are dead. After 5 years or so of research on this, I find out mussels hate potassium. I'm not sure why, and everything needs a little potassium. The whole point of this, need versus tolerance. Everything needs potassium to fire your muscles, for osmoregulatory functions, things like that. But how is it that mussels need virtually nothing compared to water fleas, our most commonly tested organism, and the midges? This is actually 1/10, so it's actually their value is up here. Now, all these guys live in the same river. So how could we consider a need where, it's like if the midges actually needed 3,000 milligrams per liter of potassium concentration. In a river, it's 100% duration. But the mussels are dying down at less than 50 parts per million. I mean, you can't have all these guys coexisting if that was a need to have that much potassium. So this goes back to a lot of folks that say, orchids, certainly the hybrids and stuff, need to have 100 ppm of X, Y, and Z, whether it's potassium or nitrogen. No. You go to your most sensitive organism and find out what they need, and everybody else really just has a tolerance. Now, this was some information that started to pop up as I got more and more into this need versus tolerance, and why it is that some plants are doing good and some plants aren't, and the effects of dose response. But in general, wild plants come from potassium-impoverished environments. We kind of established that in the first few slides, those perspective slides. This part is really cool. Instead of being passive about picking up potassium from the environment, it's an active uptake mechanism. They actually expend energy through ATP. That's the energy budget for living organisms. So in order to uptake potassium, they actually have to expend energy to pull it out. In the wild, there's very little potassium there. And that's why they have developed or evolved to be able to pull up as much potassium as they can get. It's like a kid in a candy store. They don't necessarily, they need a very tiny amount of it, but since it's so rare, they're freaking out. As soon as they can get it, they just keep sucking it up and sucking it up and sucking it up. And plants don't have kidneys like we do, so they can't get rid of it. Calcium is always more available in the environment. You can go to, and we've kind of demonstrated that too. Regardless of where you are, there's always a bunch of calcium floating around in the system. So that, once again, the plants haven't evolved an active uptake need for calcium like they have for potassium. It's always there. They can just kind of passively pick it up. This part is probably the most important part of this whole group of items. When potassium is given in excess, it reduces the plant's ability to uptake calcium magnesium. So this whole thing about plants having a calcium need, especially like the slippers, and we start throwing it into the pots and our plants still do bad, it's kind of like, well, it doesn't take a lot of potassium to make all that calcium that we're adding totally useless. No matter how much you throw in the pot, it's not going to pick it up. The plant's already locked up. And it'll always look like a calcium deficient plant. This work was done by Zox. There's a lot of orchid and epiphytic plant research done by Zox starting about 2005. So a lot of this really is kind of newish information for the orchid growers and stuff because it's expensive to do jungle research, and there's not necessarily a lot of commercial interest in orchid or bromeliad research. So cool stuff to know. It's really cool for us because it's helping me out a lot. I've been gifted over time a lot of bromeliads, and it used to be they'd all die fairly fast, so I never was overrun with bromeliads, and didn't have a huge interest, but I'm being polite and I'll just keep taking them. However, now I can't kill them anymore. I mean, they are like weeds. They're taking over. They're like blocking out windows and stuff. But some of them are still really cool. This is a little bitty guy called MiBelia Lilliputiano. If you remember Gulliver Travels, the Lilliputians. So this little guy is like 3 inches tall. And most of the neos, you have to look down in the cup to see the flower. This guy's so little, his flowers don't even fit in the cup. So it's a really cute little plant that grows really good. But anyway, the Zox went ahead and went to a commercial grower, and they had a whole bunch of bromeliads of one species, and on one side of the greenhouse they applied water with no supplemental potassium. On the other side of the greenhouse they applied water with in this case 90 ppm of potassium. And then they analyzed the leaves. And the plants that got potassium went through the roof for terms of being able to take the potassium in. So if we get back to that original myth, plants only take what they need and leave the rest behind. How come the plants that didn't get potassium, which grew just fine, grew just as good as the potassium plants? They were able to acquire it from somewhere, but on the other hand, those guys that were given the extra went ahead and sucked it up as much as they can. Another perspective case, when you're talking, this is our Biology 101A question from high school. You are what you eat. At any given time, all plants, not just orchids, but just about all plants, are 85% water, about 14% carbon, and less than 1% all the cool stuff that we're talking about tonight. So on a perspective basis, why are we getting so hung up on 1% or less of what the plants want or need? The other part goes back to just basic water metabolism, or why water ends up in the plants from metabolism. We notice that, yes, they need water and CO2 to make sugars, and starches and carbohydrates to make cellulose. So, did you know, for a C3 plant, that's the least water efficient of our orchids, which is about 60% of the orchids we grow. It takes about 800 to 1,000 molecules of water to put 1 molecule of carbon into that plant, which is way beyond the 85% need at any given time. So plants are sucking water in and out, breathing, inhaling, moving water in and out to be able to put this little bit of carbon into the plant. And on the way, they accidentally pick up the minerals that they need to put all this together. So what we really need to be focusing on is trying to figure out ways to maximize the plant's ability to get water and CO2 into them. Not worrying about how to maximize the ability to put nitrogen into the plant or potassium into the plant. Here's a little half spicerianum seedling. It's about a year out of compot at this point. It's got a nice healthy root system on it. It's about a 4-inch leaf span, which, they come out of compot maybe an inch or two across. So, I mean, it's been growing really good for this year that it came out. So, given that at any given time, only about 1% of the plant is micros, then macros and micros, the salts, the mineral stuff. This is roughly 3,000 milligram plant. 1% is 30 milligrams. At a typical half teaspoon per feed is about 800 milligrams per liter as a concentration. When you run that back down to amount, that comes to only 37.5 milliliters of fertilizer that was required to get this plant to this size. Now, you divide that up over a year, and then we talk in teaspoons and tablespoons. That's only 2.5 tablespoons per year of fertilizer. And how many of us, when we fertilize our plants, basically saturate the pot? You know, if it's a 2-inch pot, then that's 100 cc's each time. So typically, when we fertilize weekly, we are massively overloading our pots. Orders of magnitude, right, 100 to 1,000 times more fertilizer than these plants will ever be able to pick up in a year. These guys, Poole and Seeley, back in 1978, they did the leaf tissue program for orchids. In this case, it was a little hybrid Phalaenopsis. Try to remember that the background calcium concentration is 200 milligrams per liter. So if we go to the assumption, which I think is false, that orchids pick up things with in ratio or proportion to what's available into the environment. If there was 200 milligrams per liter of calcium around, and when they applied 100 milligrams per liter of potassium, how come there's more potassium in these plants than there is calcium? Also, under the various premise, the same thing we were talking about that earlier for bromeliads, that as the potassium went up, the calcium went down. It's not very clear on this one because it's almost flat for magnesium. And it wasn't statistically significant, but in this case, the magnesium also dropped. And also, it's extremely low. That's a hybrid fail. Here's a hybrid cat. Oh, I don't say. And you probably won't be able to remember, but notice that this got up to almost 8% leaf tissue concentration of potassium. That's an incredible amount. Oops. Cattleyas, back in '78, they recognized that they were already more sensitive to fertilizer, so they didn't run it. They only went to 200 ppm instead of 300 ppm. Once again, the potassium, as they increase potassium goes up, calcium goes down. And in both cases, or all cases, the calcium is way less than the potassium in the leaves, even though they're supplying way more calcium than they were potassium. In this case, they went all the way up here. There was 200 ppm of calcium available, if you remember. So in this case, under the premise, if we should be seeing everything picked up proportionally to what's in the environment, this line should be reversed to that line. Just showing this again. We talked about it. So any questions at this point? Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time. There's a lot of numbers on here, but basically, these are our favorite plants. Corn, yeah, it does say corn, cotton, tomatoes, cantaloupes. But, look at some of these potassium values. Here's 7%. So, I mean, even on this one here, we're still not hitting that peak of 8 that the Poole and Seeley guys saw with that Phalaenopsis. But in general, yeah, for our crop plants, with the exception of blueberries, more or less, you see these big numbers like you do in the Poole and Seeley papers, and you generally see more potassium than calcium. I mean, there's broad ranges and stuff too, but these are considered normal crop plants. So the sufficiency standards say that this is normal, and you get healthy plants. But if you remember, the goal of our crop plants is totally different. You want to get something to go from seed to food in 6 months, and then you throw it away, the leftovers. You're not in it for the long haul. If you look at blueberries, these numbers here are much more representative of actual leaf tissue numbers for Panamanian orchids. So when we want to model our nutrition system, we probably ought to look to the blueberry guys, which once again is a big bush that lives year after year after year. Zots, once again, jumped into the jungle in Panama and measured leaf tissue concentrations in all these orchid species. There's some extreme ones in there in both directions. One thing, when I sifted through the data, I noticed that, okay, if you, the average for all there's actually in general, 20 some odd milligrams per gram calcium relative to 15.7 on potassium. So a little bit higher on calcium relative to potassium, which is totally reversed from all of our MSU theories. Now, I split it out because this is really cool from an eco standpoint. If this was a species that's associated with ants, these guys are like the ones that if you touch them in the wild, you're going to start getting bit up by ants. That those guys typically had a little bit more potassium than calcium, and also tended to run higher numbers in general for all the nutrients. But if you looked at species that don't normally associate with ants, you get almost a 2-to-1 ratio of calcium to potassium. Not a lot of potassium floating around in the leaves of orchid species that don't associate with ants. Let's see here, I put the Panamanian one up there. I found a paper on Asian species, bobos, pavs, garayas, dendros, cotylogenes. Once again, not much potassium relative to the calcium. So it holds up for Southeast Asia too. Once again, MSU fertilizer for reference, twice as much potassium as calcium. Panamanian and orchids, the ones that's really close to 50-50, as opposed to 2-to-1 for potassium calcium. Phragmopedium. This is a number from Manola Arias again. Look at all this calcium. It's like 5 times the calcium to the potassium ratio. Nitrogen is really low too. But other species of Peruvian orchids, Cattleya rex, Cattleya maxima, they bounce around just like the Panamanian stuff. But you do have species that are relatively high in potassium and relatively low in potassium. In general, it's about 8 point, it's about at the highest ratio for high potassium plants, about equal 50-50. This is probably a typo or something like that. It's crazy weird. But honesty in research lab, we have to do it. Okay, so what do we do about this? It's like we realize that our plants don't need very much. Certainly, we're giving them a lot more than they ever need in the wild. So, how can we manage this? It's easy to see leaf tissue numbers, but how do we turn the leaf tissue numbers into real live plants? So one thing I would do is get a TDS meter. It made a big difference and a lot of surprises when I got a TDS stands for total dissolved solids, or conductivity. So there's some misnomers in here, but as a reference point, it's a lot easier to tell what's going on in your plant. It's almost like driving a car, it's like it doesn't necessarily correlate to every situation, but it gives you a reference point for how much is too much for your plants. So when you're making up your fertilizer, set it to a conductivity limit. In this case, early on I said, trees in Borneo, you get to see 80, 90 microsiemens. Not 600 or anything, as in weekly. However, I wouldn't be surprised if your tap water has a conductivity of about 600 or so microsiemens, maybe 400, somewhere in there. Without a TDS meter, you won't know. However, I can guarantee that it has virtually no potassium in it. So the correlation between TDS and potassium is not absolute by any means. So you got to be able to reference it to whatever you're working with. All conductivity is not bad, is another way to say it. You can have conductivity that's based on calcium sulfate, which won't do anything at all to your plants, compared to conductivity based on potassium chloride, which is going to be really hard on your plants. If you can't do the math, then just feed lower concentrations. Just start trying. If you're normally doing a half a teaspoon per gallon, cut it down to a quarter teaspoon per gallon. See how that works out. Start adding it back into tap water instead of RO water, or partial blends of tap water and RO. I ended up, through the time, being strictly an RO grower, which is reverse osmosis for pure water, no salt water. to putting about 10% of my well water back in. And there's a lot of calcium in silicates. You might have seen a silicate number floating around. I think that that's beneficial for the plants. So anyway, the main thing is to feed less, I said food, supplement less, water more. We notice that it takes a lot of water to get these plants to grow. And so many of us, you know, like root rots, I mean, we're so scared to water our plants because we're scared of rots. We're going to come up with see something pretty amazing later on in terms of disease and potassium. But in general, we're underwatering our plants. Our plants want water and CO2 to grow. And because we're so focused on the nutrient supplements, we're actually making it hard to water enough to keep our plants growing good. Let's see here, concentrations, reduce K proportionally, feed, nitrogen, salt. Oh, because until we developed K-Lite is a fertilizer supplement made by the same folks who made MSU, and they made it for us specifically. K-Lite is a low potassium feed. What I was doing is taking my MSU fertilizer and cutting it with calcium nitrate and Epsom salts to make my own low potassium feed. So the main thing is just proportional math to get rid of the potassium and try to hold the nitrogen stable. Over time, I've actually dropped out everything down. I feed a tiny fraction of what I used to 5 years ago. And I haven't found the bottom yet. I keep cutting back, and it just keeps growing better and better. One thing that we do all the time is start switching to CEC, low CEC, cation exchange capacity potting mixes. The cation exchange capacity means that it wants to uptake, namely the monovalent sodium and potassium, and give off the calcium and magnesium. So when you have a low CEC mix, it has less capability of retaining the potassium and sodium from the water. And eventually it becomes calcium starved after it bleeds it all or burps it all off. But in general, when you're like Orchid bark, if you read their advertisements in the back of the AOS magazine, they advertise it specifically as being a low CEC potting mix. Mounting is about as low as you can get. Baskets, plastic baskets with virtually no material in it. Vandas get the lowest CEC potting system around when you just hang them from a wire. You know, there's no potting mix whatsoever to retain potassium. And this is something I like to do a lot. You know, find the makeup of your native water and tweak it for just what you need for your plants. You know, you don't have to give it potassium, you know, a high potassium fertilizer if there's only 3 to 4 ppm floating around in your drinking water anyway. Most of us would find that we would take our drinking water, maybe dilute it down somewhat with our own water, and then add in a little teeny amount of nitrogen and phosphorus for our plants. Some of us used to use bone meal. Do you know what bone meal is? Calcium phosphate. That's a great source of phosphorus and calcium. You don't even have to use, you know, get phosphorus in your drinking water at that point. You just spike a little bit in your pots. Ammonium nitrate instead of ammonium phosphate, or ammonium phosphate is kind of hard to get. But ammonium sulfate is something you can get from Home Depot. That's a good source of ammonia and sulfate, which is really benign, that you could add into your tap water. So there's a lot of ways to skin this cat. I'll leave my email address, and if you have questions, we can work on a program. So this is kind of putting it together once again, taking the Sealy data, pool and Sealy data, this is for the cat layout, and then adding in the Panamanian data. So you can see that it's two different worlds. This is what the leaves are like in Panamanian orchids, and this is what we were able to produce in our greenhouses when we feed according to the methods of pool and Sealy. This is just for reiterating what we learned earlier. I know everyone wants to know, how do I do this for my plants? You know, there's so many ways around this that I'm going to just give you the numbers of what I expose my plants to. My plants have been seeing this water for the last 2 years, and they just keep getting bigger and bigger. So right now the pH is about 6.81. Connectivity is only, on average, about 60 microsievers. Hardness is 26.4. That's the measure of concentration of magnesium and calcium. Alkalinity is really low. I run a low TS system compared to, or a low alkalinity system compared to what Kovacii likes. It's only 20 milligrams. That's 24.4 milligrams of bicarbonate. Calcium levels, 6.8 milligrams, 2.3 milligrams per liter of magnesium. See, that's lower than, once again, what Kovacii is normally. But it seems to be doing really good for, you know, the collection as a whole. And certainly all the epiphytic stuff I've got. Nitrate, 3.7 milligrams. Certainly nowhere near, you know, the 100 ppm you'd get if you were feeding weekly. This whole presentation is on this laptop, and Janet's going to pull it off later on too. So if you don't get all this written down, then you'll be able to pull the slide later on. Phosphorus is only 1 ppm. Potassium, less than 1 ppm. So yeah, I've really choked this thing down on a potassium basis. Keep in mind that in the good old days, I was getting at least 115 ppm, 113 ppm at least once a week. Multiply that out for a whole year. I'm down to, I think, about 1/500th or something of what I used to feed in potassium. Sulfate is about 3.0 milligrams per liter. Most of that's coming in from my well water, by the way. Silicates are around 3 milligrams per liter. That's also coming in mostly from my well water. I talked about different bark types. This is going back over the whole CEC thing. And this was kind of recent data that I got from a guy who was consulting for the Orchids people. But yes, you know, using a potting mix with a low CEC can change how your plants grow. In this case, they compared Orchid bark, pine bark, or standard pine bark, so moss, saggy moss, and coconut bark. These are really commonly used potting mixes or potting syrup. This line here is the amount of potassium held up in those big matrices after about a year of exposure. This is the amount of potassium in the roots. This was a hybrid Phalaenopsis growing in these different conditions. And this is the amount of potassium in the leaves in those same plants after about a year of exposure. So you can see, yeah, you know, you got a low CEC potting mix versus a high CEC potting mix. You see a little bit of an increase in the amount of potassium it's holding up. Actually, if you see the number, this is milligrams per gram, this is like 800 milligrams per gram as opposed to 2,000 milligrams per gram. So this scale is really blown out. Or ppm, I should say. This works out to about, this is a ppm on this part here. 2,000 ppm versus 800 ppm. So it really is a significant increase in potassium. But you see that the plants are responding way bigger than what you would see in the potting mix. So basically, what we see is a relatively modest increase in potassium holdup in the potting mix is making a big difference in the amount of being transmitted into the plant. Go for some case examples. Epiphytic plants. This is my Phalaenopsis parishii. I bought this from Andy's Orchids, I think, in 2003. It's a cute little, does any of you guys grow this one? It's a miniature Phalaenopsis. The plaque is only about this tall. The flowers are maybe a ½ inch tall, very fragrant, but it's a little bit of a booger. It tends to go deciduous when it's unhappy. It drops all its leaves. Some people thought that was normal, and it would tend to lose its roots periodically too. So it's been an up and down plant for me over the years. But starting in 2011, it just went to town. And roots, brand new roots coming off the mountain in all directions and blooming every single year. This was 2013, and I did. A lot of people thought I'd be starting my plants when I started doing this. This one, you know, it's a giant baby huey. This is Phalaenopsis gigantea. When I first got this in 2010, it was about a 4 to 6 inch seedling. And the ruler is rusty, but you can see that that leaf is about a foot. So it took about 2 years to go from 4 inch seedling, 6 inch seedling to this plant, and it bloomed this year for me. It's in bloom right now, actually. It's often considered a delicate plant that people tend to lose a lot of. I've also done well with these two. This is a Phalaenopsis fasciata. This one actually is really cool because it smells like tangerines when it's in bloom. I don't know how many of them are fragrant, but this one is really nice. I was supposed to be at my brother's wedding. I didn't make it for the vows, but they had those big giant Santa Barbara estate sales, Santa Barbara Orchid Estates, which was on the same day as my brother's wedding, so I was out buying orchids. It was a single fan seedling when I first got it back in 2002. It's the original mother plant is gone, but since 2011, once again, you know, the number of growth, the quality of the roots. This is only about half the plant. There's a giant pile of freehanging kikis down there, and the blooming quality has increased dramatically in the last few years. Phalaenopsis palens, often kind of a slow one, but you know, it's growing and blooming great. This is a pretty healthy looking plant. The size of the leaves, actually, what's kind of interesting is that these guys tend to have really small growths, and I would say that, especially on the palens, leaf size is increased by somewhere between 20 and 40%. So definitely not getting smaller with less nutrition. One thing that I noticed kind of early on, and this was unexpected. I mean, when I was going through my collection, you know, I would have considered this, the green is good. It's a good sized plant, good sized growth. You know, the roots are there. No real problems. But right after I started this, reducing the potassium, all of a sudden I started getting these big shiny growths. This isn't polished. This just happened. And the texture of these things is like shoe leather now. They're really plowing the calcium in. Once again, you take the potassium out of the plant, you can get calcium into the new growths much heavier. You get a much stiffer, shinier leaf. And they do still bloom. So this thing's bloomed every single year since I started this. It's a big plant, keeps getting bigger, and it just keeps blooming. I'm real satisfied with it. Cattleya gascoliana. It was a pretty big plant when I got it. I think most of you guys back in would be satisfied with that plant. I was satisfied with it, you know. But I only put it in here because a year after I started reducing the K, it went from about this, which is okay, to this, and then the following year to this. So I'm not starving my plants. They just keep getting bigger and better the whole time. It fell off the shelf in 2015, and I ended up having this is not repotted during this whole time, too. So. Barbatapaps, a lot of people have problems with these. They play a lot of tricks. They either want to underpot them. Some people have, I can grow them in moss, but I can't grow them in coconut husk, or I can grow them in but anyway, I started playing around with this basket system, which is usually mostly rock and sphagnum moss. And in the AOS article I wrote, you could see it on the older growths, but the plant would never get much more than 8 inches across. This one here is, this individual leaf is over 12 inches across. So because it's vertical, it's hard to get a big leaf span. But it's gone from about an 8-inch leaf span plant to something that's at least 14 some odd inches across. It produces 2 to 3 growths a year now, and blooms sometimes twice a year. And this is a species plant from Sumatra. This flower is actually pretty good size. That's about a 16 centimeter flower. So it's a cool species, not really bright, but it's kind of interesting, and it's got it's a nice subtle flower. I like it. I got an HCC on it too. Paphortii. I was killing a lot of Sucaculii, so I thought, well, maybe if I switch to another species, I'd get better results. They're kind of similar to Sucaculii. But anyway, I killed all my original mother plants, got a group of seedlings after I bred it, got the seedlings back from Troy Myers. Any of you guys work with Troy Myers? Myers Conservancy in Seattle, where they're about Washington State. It's a really cool kind of a co-op deal. If you produce species seed and send it to him, he will flask it for free and send you back a flask of babies to grow out. So this was, this guy is actually my first AM for slippers. I picked up a couple for other things. But anyway, I'm pretty excited about this. I got the pollen, put it into a mother plant, which is long gone. And I think back in 2005 or so. And I lost most of them before they bloomed. But this lingering surviving plant managed to make it to my new fertilizer tank and produce some pretty nice flowers, which I rewarded. It's still kicking out somewhere between 2 to 3 growths a year. Sometimes I'll have up to 4 or 5 flowers open at a time. Now it's a really prolific, easy plant. Master Sienum is a species that people kill like crazy. All my original mother plants deceased before the fertilizer program came in. I managed to get a bunch of babies from Troy Myers, 10 of them. You can see I potted some of them out in the baskets. That's somewhat inconsequential. But as opposed to taking 5 to 6 years to get something to bloom, I was able to get these guys to bloom in less than 3 years out of flask. And they went from a plant that normally never got more than 8 to 10 inches across to a plant that's like 14 inches across. Which, that's about the smaller end of what they should be in the wild, quite honestly. Do you guys have, the type descriptions are available for these species in various books. And it's amazing from going through a lot of literature how big these guys actually are in the wild. And nowadays, people are taking more and more eco-vacations, and I'm seeing a lot more stuff on the internet. And these guys are huge in the wild. It's like it would make our stuff look really bad. So. Another one I got an AM on was this Pathworld Herminiae. And it's a really cool multifloral. This was the first year that this seedling bloomed. So it's a first-year seedling when I got an AM on it. This is the original mother plant that I got from Andy's that I've been beating up and destroying and trying to resurrect ever since I got it in like 2004. This is its baby, and this is its first blooming, and this year it bloomed again with 3 flowers instead of 2, which is really kind of a maximum number for this. So I'm pretty thrilled with this plant. The basket system, once again, as they start to get bigger and the roots start coming out, I just, instead of repotting and starting over, I just plunk them into a bigger basket. And you can see the root is already coming out of the second basket. This little plant here, this is Paphiopedilum colopeckingii. This is one of the biggest of the slipper orchids. In December 2010, this plant was a 4-inch rootless nub of a plant, and I figured, what the heck, it's only going to get, either it's going to get better or it's going to die. So I stuck it in this basket, and this is a picture from this year. So from 4 inches to about 3 feet across in 4 years. And actually, you can see there's a little bit of a second growth in there. So, and once again, a little will for size comparison. These are big monster plants, and they grow extremely fast with very little fertilizer. I bought this Rothschildianum. This is a popular one for the path growers. But I originally bought a single fan plant. It was about a 10-inch seedling in 2002. It looked about like this, maybe a little greener. And Clark Riley was the person I bought it from. Said, "Oh, it ought to be blooming for you in about 2 or 3 years." And from 2002 to pretty much 2011, you know, it was about this little stubby thing that never did anything for me. Sometimes it would add a growth, lose a growth, add a growth, lose a growth, add 3 growths, lose 1 growth. And so in 2011, I had 2 growths left in a pot that looked like this. This is one of them, and this is the other one 2 years later. So it went from this to this in about 2.5, 3 years. That flower's about a foot across. It's a really cool flower for people that enjoy moss. Parishii is another one of my poster children for surviving low potassium feed. This was a species that I lost a lot of them. I'd get them in, they'd stay about 8, 10 inches across, 8 to 10 inches across, and spike and die. I'd get another one. 8 inches, spike, and die. And then I got a few more. About the time I was doing low potassium, got to 2 foot and spiked and doing great. More growths coming up. So if you go through the books, once again, these guys are supposed to be big. They're not supposed to be compact. That's what often happens. We have a bunch of little guys and we kind of normalize it in our head and say, oh, this is the compact variety. You change the nutrition, a lot of times they go nuts. The other big cliff dwellers like Stonii, Supardii, these are all doing great. I used to have to keep these guys, which normally are 2 foot across, span, in little 2-inch pots to keep from what I thought I was overwatering. How many of us orchid people do that? We underpot so that we don't overwater. So it was crazy. I'd have this huge plant in a little bitty 2-inch pot to keep the roots from rotting off. This is a 2-foot spanned Stonii, but it's in a 6-inch basket. Roots coming out in all directions. It's not the basket, folks. It's fertilizer or lack thereof.
And are you using spackling on those?
It's actually mostly rock. Limestone. I live in Nashville, and we have access to a lot of limestone there, and so people like to put it in their driveways, including myself. So that basket is moss lined. Put the plant in, chunk in a ton of big chunky limestone gravel, and then there may be a little bit of potting, coconut husk or something thrown on top. And I often seed these guys too with live moss. I was mentioning to Dan, I kind of use the moss and ferns as an indicator of whether they're getting too salty. The moss in particular seems to be an indicator of higher TDS conditions. They don't seem to like it very much. Whether or not there's beneficial things happening with moss is a whole other matter altogether. I know that nitrogen-fixing bacteria, mainly blue-green algae, associated with moss. So, you get your nitrogen levels low enough, you may actually have a little bit of natural nitrogen fixation going on to supply the plant. Whether or not there's a little bit of hormones and amino acids in the transfer like that, I'm not going to vouch for that. But I do know that typically if I get the live moss kicking in really good, then the plants are usually really good. And I never used to be able to do it with a weekly fertilizer feeding rate. Another problem child for people is this Paf henrianum. These guys live on limestone cliffs in North Vietnam. A lot of times the roots are completely exposed. You just see a rock with these little slippers growing right on it. And I would go through a fair amount of them. Most of the time they die of Erwinia, that basal rot. They grow like crazy for a year or two, start blooming, and then each year the growths would come back successively smaller and smaller until you get down to just a few little nubby growths, and then it'll get Erwinia and die. So the other part of this has to look at the seedlings. This guy here was a seedling I produced from a breeding, I think in 2004. And this guy especially, were seedlings I produced in 2011. This one here took 6 to 7 years before I saw its first bloom. And 80% of its classmates died before I got to it. This guy here, I can't kill any of these guys. I've given most of them away. And it bloomed in 2.5 years out of flask. So the growth rate on my seedlings has gone way up, and my mortality rate's gone way down since going into this program. Once again, that's a reapplication of the size matters thing I talked about for aquatic toxicity. Seedlings are much more sensitive than the big adult plants. They just can't take the beating. You take off the fertilizer, and you can grow these guys very fast. Disease resistance. We talked about losing a lot of my Slippers Gerwinia, that funky basal rot. Now this study was done by the Fluid Fertilizer Institute, but they were working on bean tissue, beans, as opposed to orchids. There's not a lot of good research out there on orchids, mainly because of the commercial application of crop science. But in a challenge test, if you're familiar with a challenge test, bacterial challenge, they culture up pure bacteria or pure fungus or pure virus. And then they manipulate the plants for different reasons. In this case, they manipulated the plant for higher calcium content in the leaf, which as you know means it has to have lower potassium in the leaf. And then they would take a bottle of pure Orchidia and dump it on the plants and see how many they could kill. And in this case, when they got the calcium content in the beans up to 3.4%, they couldn't kill them with Orchidia anymore. But they had almost 100% kill at low concentrations of calcium in the leaves. Botrytis. This is a botrytis challenge study. And a lot of cat growers I know are always having problems with botrytis. Those little black speckles all over the flowers and everything. It kills, it'll kill beans pretty outright. But once again, as potassium went up, calcium went down, and the plant's ability to fight off botrytis went way down. More calcium lovers. Emersonii is a species that grows on Vietnamese cliffs. I bought this little baby from Orchid Babies. You guys know Earl and Helen, Orchid Babies folks in Alabama?
Mm-hmm.
They've since retired. But anyway, it's a tough plant. Most people kill them. And for years, it was a little bitty thing, stumpy thing that would add a growth, lose a growth, add a growth, lose its roots, add its roots, lose a growth. And it stayed pretty much a little teen plant until I took the potassium out of the system. And then it turned into this multi-growth plant and bloomed for its first time, and I got an AM on it. So it's pretty cool. So it's still blooming to this day. New blooms. It's not continuously blooming. And still adding growths. So I'm pretty satisfied that the reason it's doing so much better is not just that I got it to a point where I was satisfied with what it was doing, but because of the way I changed the nutrition. Little bitty Phragmipedium, that's Fisheri, a plant that everyone says you got to keep a lot of oyster shell in the pot. I killed a bunch of these guys plowing oyster shell in the pots. It never did good. I got 2 new ones in them. No oyster shell, low potassium feed. I get it to blooming size in about 2 years. And the plant, instead of being this little stubby thing that was about 4 inches across, is well over a foot across. It's like, this is a totally different plant. Mexipedium, it's hard to see on this flower, but that's a Mexipedium flower. Mexipedium xerophyticum. Comes from limestone sinkholes in Mexico. Some people think that it might actually be extinct in the wild, but a lot of people have problems with it. And I didn't think I had problems with it. It was doing good for me, putting on a lot of growth, and probably lose about 2 growths out of 5 to Erwinia. And the plant was like this stubby plant with ice plant-like leaves, very succulent, very thick, juicy leaves. And then after taking the potassium out, instead of being like 6 inches across, leaves are like 10 inches across. And instead of being thick and juicy, they're like shoe leather now. It's a totally different plant. Once again, there's sandstone-based plants as well as limestone-based plants. That's the same Emersonii that you saw earlier. This is my Delamattii. This is the flower on the very first slide. And that's an 8-inch basket. So you can see that this is a big plant, produces growths like crazy. These are all seed capsules from the breedings. It blooms, let's see, this past 2015 show, it had 5 flowers open at once on this plant. Because some of these guys are also, they'll produce 2 flowers or spike too. It's a really cool plant, and the foliage is real pretty on it too. A lot of these plants are improving in their ability to clump up. A lot of times I know people with slippers get kind of frustrated that, they only seem to have 1 or 2 growths per pot at a given time. And some of them are easier to clump than others. I've never had a problem with Quercetissimum in terms of clumping. That's a 6-inch pot, by the way. So you can see that there's a lot of growths in that pot. It's a cool flower. It's a good-sized flower, about 15, 16 centimeters. And it's a very long-lasting flower. This flower will last about a month. But certainly, this thing has not been hurt at all by reducing the fertilizer. And in fact, the leaf texture and quality is improving considerably on this plant. I've had it since 2001. So once again, I would not have used this as an example of why my culture is bad. I was pretty satisfied with this plant. But it's certainly been a nice surprise on how much better it's gotten. On the other hand, this Charlesworthii is a really nice big flower, about this big, big giant dorsal sepal. This is from Burma. This is the last of my surviving seedlings from breeding in like 2004. Lost all the rest. And I was lucky that I was able to get this last one to kind of make it all the way through. Mainly it was neglect. It's like a lot of these, I'll just put them in the back of the greenhouse and kind of forget to feed them and stuff. And the ones that's like, oh, this one's doing good, and I'll take it out and I'll focus on it and start giving it more fertilizer and stuff, and then they go down. So anyway, I had one that made it probably out of benign neglect in the back of the greenhouse. I pulled it up, put it in this basket, and when I started the program, and it just went to town. Multiple growths, multiple bloomings, much better plant. It's hard, not necessarily focused, but you see all the roots coming out of the basket. And I just moved it up from the 4-inch basket to the 6-inch basket. So it's an expanding plant. This is that Mexipedium I was talking about. When I bought it, there's a little 4-inch pot in here. That was the original plant. There's about 4 growths in it. So you see it's doing pretty good.
That's a clay pot in the center?
No, it's a little plastic pot in the middle.
You don't even take it out of the plastic?
Sometimes. I do on other stuff. It's not a rule. But it seemed to, at the time when I put it in this thing, it actually had a lot of kikis that were hanging off the side. So.
So are the kikis what rooted into
this part?
Yeah.
Yep. And then they're coming out the side. There's a stolen right now.
It's pretty cool.
And actually I've taken this is a 10-inch pot, and I just stuck it into, I did this a couple months ago. So I'm trying to get like the wedding cake effect and just put it into bigger stuff and see if I can get it.
You repot. It's a quick method.
So, but the stuff in the middle doesn't necessarily need to die out, and there's still pot mix in there. So they'll come back over the top. But I don't know if I can find it in here anymore. You know, run around with a ruler in terms of like looking at the length of that leaf relative to, you know, like one of these older growths here. And certainly you can't tell the texture. You know, it's like how they used to be all kind of like ice plant, kind of squishy. And now it's kind of like, you know, big giant long leaf that's all like shoe leather. So there's going to be more coming up. And, you know, as you noticed from earlier on, there are orchids that definitely appreciate a certain amount of extra potassium. So some of the ant feeders, and I'm really interested in these Coryanthes, the bucket orchids. This is Coryanthes fieldinii. It's a bucket orchid that I've been reasonably successful in. It's not doing as good as I would like, but, you know, and it may end up being a certain case where I want to do more stuff with kelp on it, a little bit of extra potassium, but it's kind of holding its own. Gongoras, I've got several gongoras in my collection. These guys are having no problems at all with reduced potassium, even though they're typically an ant plant. So, a lot of these guys in this group are really cool for the fertilization, pollination, I should say. We can talk about this another time. And then Stanophias. Any of you guys grow Stanophias? So, huge plant. Well, one thing that's kind of negative about all these guys, the flowers only last for a couple days. But they usually, well, the bucket orchids only produce like, you know, 2 flowers at a time. They may produce several spikes on a big plant. Same for the Stanophias. But at least here with the gongoras, and they're normally smaller flowers, but they'll produce a spike with, you know, 20, 30, 50 flowers on a spike. Very fragrant, and my gongoras will produce multiple spikes. So it's like, even though the spike of flowers is only going to last 4 or 5 days max, you know, if they stagger them, then you get to have these guys bloom for a full month at a time. But there's people that do much better with Stanophias than I do, like certain bucket orchids. But they are, I mean, this is a really cool plant. And it's a big flower too, it's as big as my hand.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I don't understand this ants and no ants thing. Are you talking about ants
Yeah.
that crawl around? Is
Ants
good
that
or
crawl
bad?
around. For these guys, it's good.
Okay.
It's kind of a pain. I mean, they don't do it in my greenhouse, especially if I put out ant baits. But in the wild, yeah, in the wild, where you find bucket orchids, the entire plant, I mean, it's like a giant ant nest surrounding the roots on these guys. So
Is
they,
it bad or good or?
no, they love it.
Oh, they love it?
And they seem to, you know, it's like the ants are like little farmers. They kind of like do what we do with tomatoes and corn. So,
I'm having a terrible time with them this year. And I have lots of lizards, so I didn't want to put any bait out because I didn't know if we'd get one lizards.
sure. Well, you know, I'd probably use, you know, like the boric acid traps or something on it. And then, you know, the ants will climb in and,
I know, but when my lizards get in there, I got some real cute little babies.
you know, a lot of the anoles don't really eat ants anyway. I mean,
Okay,
pointing
well, I
to
know
them-
they don't eat them. I don't want to kill my lizards.
No, no, the boric acid traps.
Uh-huh.
You know, it's like, what's the one that's, I'll have to work, it's like, you could put it in a closed thing, but it's just like a little, few drops of this sugar and boric acid syrup.
They're good for it, do I want to do that?
Oh, they come in it, and they eat it, and then they take it down to the nest
So,
and
but
die.
do I want to get rid of the ants if they are good for it?
I really think that for most plants, it's kind of a detrimental thing to have the ants
Okay.
in a greenhouse. Certainly, it's kind of like, I hate picking up a pot and having ants all over my hands and stuff.
Well, mine's just in the garage, and I tried to flood them, but
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of a pain. I mean, if you really are dealing with bucket orchids and you want to see what they do in the wild, or your Stanophias, but, you know, a lot of times too, when we're overfeeding our plants, they're actually exuding sugars into the substrate unnaturally. So, I mean, they're kind of encouraging a lot of ant stuff.
okay.
So, you know, as I've been cutting down, I'm having less and less ant problems in general with the stuff that doesn't care about it. So, You know, it's like, they don't have to have ants, as far as I know. I mean, the Coryanthes, there's not that many people that do good with those, and I'm not gonna call myself a good Coryanthes tree or grower.
Oh, let's talk about ants.
Yeah, but these guys, Stanophias and Gondoras in particular, they don't seem to have nearly the requirement for ants. And, but, you know, as a plant that usually works with ants in the wild, these guys, in particular the Gondoras, grow great for me without having to do a lot of special supplementation. Excuse me. And that's the end. We made it. Thank you. There's a whole bunch of references that went into putting this talk together. So, like I said, the talk is now on this computer, and it will be available to the whole society. And, you know, how you're able to find some of these things. I have a lot of this stuff in reprint collections at home, but a lot of stuff you can actually pull off the internet. This is a better thing to look at. Yes, sir.
I'm using rainwater, and sounds like I could definitely cut back on potassium. But how long does it take to leach out, or you know what should be the expectation of the way to go about it?
Yeah. So, except possibly, and I don't have anything to back it up, but it seems like magnesium might be a slight way to get a purgative effect. So, through Epsom salt use, you may want to try a few, a quarter teaspoon, especially if you're only dealing with rainwater, maybe a quarter teaspoon per gallon of Epsom salts for several waterings. You might see a big boost in color factor of the leaves. You know, it's like on that Dillonadii, it's like a nice nice and crisp blue and white leaf. Well, before I started doing the low potassium thing, I thought, maybe these guys need a little Epsom salts. And when I did some Epsom salt applications, I noticed some pretty big improvements in the leaf quality, mostly the color of like the Dillonadii. And so, if you give a little extra magnesium, more than what you need, and I'd only do it for a few times off the top, but at least initially, the magnesium might speed it up a little bit, and or help get it out of the pot mix. So, I'd go ahead and take my time for sure, and probably the one thing that might work out best is that right now you're using rainwater. Cut back in 10-20% city water, but don't give any supplemented nitrogen at all for like 6 months. Are you doing weekly?
Yeah.
I'd try probably cutting all nitrogen out of the system for, if you just can't stand it after a month, then come back in a little bit. But see how far out you can go without adding any NPK at all.
And what about phosphorus? What about phosphorus?
I think there's probably plenty in the potting mixes and stuff, unless you want to completely repot out and start over from scratch. So, I mean, as you noticed on the that one slide with the Orchiata bark stuff, that's how much built up in there over the course of a year. So I mean, there's ppms of stuff in the potting mix, and typically we don't really store a lot of nitrogen in very well at all. That's not nearly the salt that we tend to see. But potassium for sure, and a certain amount of phosphorus will tie up in the potting mix.
Maybe clay pellets and some.
Oh yeah, those clay pellets have a lot of CEC capacity to them. In fact, I was just working with Rick Hepler over in the Houston Society, and he just called me a little while ago, and it's like he took those clay balls out and just started soaking them in some rainwater, and overnight they ended up discharging conductivity of over 300.
So if I'm using rainwater, they're going to release it and get it out of the system.
Eventually. Now, one thing that's goes back to what's that?
Perlite?
Yeah, except that perlite is a little bit more like just, it's really porous and holds a lot of water. So that'll actually discharge really fast. But the coconut husk, sphagnum moss, and clay balls, they actually are retaining a lot of potassium on a charge basis. So if you go back to, say, that old Antec website, and it's got a huge treatise in there on how to deal with coconut mix. And it says that, you know, you get your coconut mix in, and the first thing you do actually is you set it up in a barrel of rainwater, but then you add in a really high dose of calcium nitrate and a high dose of Epsom salts. And it really takes that extra calcium and magnesium to draw out the potassium out of that coconut husk. You could set it in RO water, rainwater, till the cows come home, and it'll go down 80%, but it'll never purge out all of the all of that.
If you have some salts,
Right. So, you know, I do a lot of work in my toxicology thing with ion exchange resins, which are even more severe in that respect. I mean, they're geared up for sucking up things and releasing things. And the only way you can actually reverse out things like zeolites and ion exchange resins is by soaking them concentrate in the opposite charge that they're, not charge, in the opposite material that they're trying to pull out. So in the case of when they're trying to pull out potassium and stuff like that, they're like really sucking that up good. And in order to purge it out, you usually have to put it through something with a lot of calcium in it.
A way to measure what's in our water.
Hard
Take
as
it
it's
into a
done.
lab sometimes to get that complete analysis of what everything is.
And actually, there's a gal in the Houston Society that works with empirical labs, and you know, and talking to her might be kind of interesting in terms of being able to set up a program for orchid growers so that you can analyze what's in your potting mix, not on a solid basis. Do any of you guys do pour throughs, or how many of you guys have a conductivity meter? Okay, so there's a company called Hannah that makes a good one for soil sciences, and I think it should be under $100.
Would we be able to check for the extension agents, see here?
Oh, for
See
sure.
if they,
But on the other hand, I mean, I just Googled up soil conductivity meter by Hannah. And it doesn't have an H on it, it's H-A-N-N-A. And, yeah, I bought one, and it's even got a long, like a knitting needle probe on it, so you can stick it in your potting mix and find out how much salts are being retained in your potting mix. Or do what's called a pour-through test, where you take your pot, you take rainwater or distilled water, and you pour it through the pot, collect it, pour through several times, and see how much salt balance is building up in your pots. It's pretty instructive. It's kind of scary, like I was telling that gentleman.
maybe something the society could do with a meter or whatever,
Yeah,
bring it in our potting mixes.
right. Yes, sir. Dan.
Well, Rick, what about semi-hydro with those white pellets?
I do it, especially with my frags, and it's taking longer to bleach it all out, or in some cases I'll just replace it and start over again. I'll just replace it. But no, semi-hydro is a very viable, because remember, a lot of this has to do with maximizing the water and CO2 that these plants get. So I like semi-hydro. I think it's a viable system. I do it with all my frags.
Will you treat the pellets first in order to pull out the salt?
You can.
You don't have to.
I think when you first get them, they're probably not in too bad shape. Unlike coconut husk, which has often been washed in marine water. So that's why a lot of the coconut husk is often really high in potassium.
Some guys recommend soaking it in calcium nitrate and magnesium sulfate, but not necessarily. You don't need to necessarily.
For the clay
Like
balls,
pellets, when you first get them to do that, to an ion exchange, to clean them up,
I've never done it,
so you don't come off.
but I don't think it hurt. You know, and after you do those soaks in calcium nitrate and Epsom salts, then go ahead and stick them in RO water or rainwater and let them equalize out. And generally, you know, it's like I try to make sure that when the potting mix hits the plants, that its conductivity is as low as it's going to get via pour-through test. So
But if you're using harder water, will they tend to collect the salts then?
they're going to collect calcium and magnesium, but they aren't going to be collecting sodium and potassium. Correct. And there's no problem with having too much calcium in the system.
So generally, it's pretty decent product. How about using that in conjunction with, I mean, some people may say that they're water groups.
You know, a lot of people are always worried about having too much water retained in their mix. But, you know, as I've been cutting down the nitrogen and the potassium, I'm watering more and more. And in fact, this I think is the bottom line test. You know those bamboo things they sell at Trader Joe's, I should say, Trader Joe's, they're just in glass beads. And you set them in trays of water, and they do fine. But, so I've got paths sitting in cups of glass beads with a tray of water underneath. One of them's been in there since November of last year, and the roots are coming through the bottom of the pot going into the tray of water. So, you know, this whole thing about excess water and root rot, you know, is quickly turning into a total fallacy. It's continuous high nitrogen water that's bacteria, full of bacteria and stuff, is what causes root rot. The water itself, what's that?
I'm sorry, do you flush that water that you have them living in the glass?
Uh-huh.
And there's water underneath. Do you water through the plant into that, or do you just rinse that water at the bottom, or?
It started out, I was kind of trying to be religious about pouring out the old water and adding new water every day.
Yeah.
And then I got lazy, so it's like once a week. And now it's pretty much, I've got multiple plants in the system now. So they're in a tray, and I just pour some new water through the top of the pots and let it overflow out. Sometimes it's there for a week. If I start to see too much algae buildup, I take the whole thing apart, scrub it out, and set it back up. But, I mean, we used to basically say that it was impossible to do continuous water at the roots for slippers.
Right.
I would say that when I was doing 30 to 40 ppm of nitrogen, or 100 ppm of nitrogen, yeah. Or it's kind of fun. I used to lose roots all the time, back when I wasn't even doing, you know, a hydroponic system. So it was kind of like, the way I was doing it, you know what they say about insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result? So, you know, it's like, what was wrong that I was doing the same thing as everybody else theoretically? I could have had some minor detail out of whack, who knows? But, you know, it's like I really did try to do it according to the book when I first got into this stuff. And it just, you know, didn't get me the results I wanted. So, yeah, I mean, obviously I know somebody that can do weekly feeding. But the last guy I knew that was really good at seeing his slippers grow weekly was also like changing his potting mix like twice a year. And yeah, and you know, I do twice a year. Sometimes I try it, and it just didn't do it. Or the plants would always be small, and then I convinced myself that this was just a compact variety.
I have a lot of.
So yeah, I mean, it was just shocking. I mean, I was pretty happy with some of these plants.
Worth the drive.
Yeah. And they're, you know, they're in this like, does anyone actually, you know, have documented evidence that they've actually starved a plant to death? I think that there's probably cases where we see a deficiency symptom and we don't recognize it as a case of antagonism or reverse excess. But, you know, there's a little German lady in our society. She's been growing orchids since '58. She actually had a cut flower cattler business, and she still has 5 of her 7 greenhouses going. And she has never fertilized, ever. She just draws well water out in Shelbyville, Tennessee, and waters her plants that way. She's got some collages. I mean, there's everybody's, you know, she does have some stuff dying stuff, but you You know, the first time I went over there, she showed me this Zologny pandorata, and when I looked at it the second time, I realized that it was in a frame of a glass top table, like a patio table. The glass, apparently, this thing collapsed the glass. It grew so big. And then it grew into the metal frame. So it's like we never get to see it at meetings because it's just too huge for her to pick it up. And then a lot of the plants you go and say, oh, this is nice looking, you try to pick it up, and it's like it's fused into her benches. And she's not fertilizing, she just throws more, she likes to use cypress mulch. So, you know, as the roots come out of the pots and go into the benches, she just throws cypress mulch on her benches. And it just keeps going and going.
I like it.
So,
Okay, ready for snacks?
I am.
Yeah.
So,